Oh, that's really cool.
I think we should just do one.
Oh, she was attacking me.
Yeah.
Look at that, is neat.
Uh-huh.
There's a chair.
She looks alien.
I think people think we're gonna cancel because of the weather.
Is the weather
Weather's
going to get
not
bad
that
or
bad.
something?
Not bad at all.
When Cheryl and I left today, it was kind of hailing a little bit.
Really?
Yeah,
Little ice pebbles, but they quit.
2:30.
Yeah.
Shouldn't be, the gang ain't.
Yeah, it is.
I don't know.
It is January. Yep.
Cheryl should be hailing today, the gang ain't all here.
Look at Rudolph.
Hailing the gang ain't all here.
Did I show you that one? Look at Rudolph.
All right. Good evening. We're getting smaller and smaller, but that's okay.
They'll be coming in.
They'll be coming in.
They will.
This time of year is always hard. January is hard. February is hard. Weather and cold and dark. We're in the dark ages right now. This is the worst stretch, isn't it? From Christmas to spring break.
It's all mind over matter.
I don't know, Tim. I don't know. Sometimes I'm ready for spring already. Right, Cheryl?
But I have been since September.
I know, right? Yeah, we got a ways to go. Everybody doing good?
We're here.
You're here? Ready for a good night? All right. Well, let me open with a word of prayer and we'll begin. Lord, thank you for tonight. Thank you for the opportunity to meet back together again. And we're grateful for this book. We're grateful for the discussion that we can have. And we thank you for what you have for us tonight. Teach us, Lord, instruct us. Let us know you better and be confident of our future. And let us really just come to know our Savior more and anticipate his return. Lord, looking forward to the victory that he will bring. And we pray that you'll help us to live in light of that glorious return that we look forward to. So we commit our evening to you and our class in your name. Amen. All right. Well, we are in chapter 17 yet, and so we're going to try and finish that up tonight and then dive into chapter 18. So we're getting right to the end, and we've got 19, 20, 21, 22 to go, so we're wrapping things up here fairly quickly. I think we'll try to take 1 week on each of the final chapters as well, but we'll see. Chapters 19 and 20, there's a lot of stuff in there, a lot of issues when you start dealing with, particularly chapter 20, the millennium, and a lot of those issues. So I think we'll take a week per chapter here, so like 4 weeks to go, something like that. But we'll just see how it goes as we work through this. Just a reminder again, there's no class on February 5, so you can just kind of have that on your radar. We'll meet the next 2 weeks, and then we'll be off for a week because I'll be in Florida for Courageous Churchman, and then we'll come back and wrap it up after that. And then Bob and I will be heading off to Malawi. So a couple of busy weeks coming up. You have chapter 18 notes on your desk. Hi, Ashley. And reading for chapter 19. Those are the study notes for chapter 19. So if you could have chapter 19 read for next week, that would be great. And let's dive right into chapter 17. If you do not have chapter 17 notes, you can come see Cheryl. She might have some if you need that. But we did not finish chapter 17, so open your Bibles to that chapter. And then the notes from last week, I think we're on page 5 of last week's notes on Revelation 17. So who remembers what chapter 17 is about? It's which part of the system of Antichrist's kingdom? What?
Babylon.
Yeah, it's Babylon. And which phase of it or what element of it's coming down in chapter 17? What? What?
Near the end?
Yeah, it's near the end, but we're talking here in chapter 17 about the religious system of Babylon. So as we come to chapter 17 and 18, what I want you to do is just keep in perspective that both of these chapters, 17 and 18, deal with the downfall of Babylon. So we've come through the 7 bowls, and we are, just moments before the return of Christ, or days maybe before the return of Christ. He's coming back in chapter 19. But John needs to fill in some details for us here in chapter 17 and 18. And so he's going to tell us about Babylon's fall, about the destruction of Babylon. Now, it's not going to happen completely until chapter 19, but he's going to fill in a couple descriptions of this cataclysmic destruction of Babylon. So chapter 17, you remember, was about the downfall of the religious component, the downfall of this worldwide apostate church component of Antichrist empire. So you may remember we said that when Antichrist comes to power, he's going to come up and form this one world government which has a religious component to it. And so the first half of the tribulation is probably this apostate conglomerate church. It's all of the false religions kind of pooled together, coming together under the head of Antichrist. So as we said last week, just think about all the false religions in the world. Think about Islam, and think about Hinduism and Buddhism and the Catholic system and Jehovah's Witness and Mormons and any type of so-called evangelical church that's not evangelical, like Fountain Street downtown. We talked about that a little bit last week. Throw all that together. Just pool all that together, and you've got a one world religious system. And so the Antichrist is going to use that to begin to launch his one world government. He's going to unify the world through a one world religion. Well, at some point, that has to come crashing down, and that has to be completely done away with. And so that's what chapter 17 is about. Hey, Vince and Patty, welcome. Chapter 17 is about the downfall of that religious system. So if you look in your notes, page 1 of last week's notes, just about the 5th bullet down, in chapter 17, John describes the destruction of Babylon and its religious character. In chapter 18, he describes the destruction of Babylon and its commercial character. So that you got to keep those in perspective, all right? So chapter 17 is the downfall of religious Babylon. Chapter 18 is the downfall of commercial Babylon. When we say commercial Babylon, we mean its economic system, its commerce, its ability to function as an enterprise, a government, an entity, a country, that kind of thing. So those are the two perspectives that we see in these two chapters. Now, we talked about the fact that Babylon is both a city and a system. We're probably going to see this as both, that Babylon is an actual city, most likely a rebuilding of Babylon in modern-day Iraq. You can see the map on page 1 of the notes from last week, and Babylon in red, that there it is. You can go there today. You can visit it today. It's not much of a city, but it's very likely that that's going to be the headquarters of Antichrist's world government. Perhaps Rome. We don't know quite sure. Some would say it's Rome, but it could be Babylon. So it's a city, but it's also a system. And the system is all that Antichrist is going to put into it to lead his one world government. So when we talk about the downfall of Babylon, we're talking about both the downfall and destruction of the city itself, which we'll see in just a little bit, and the downfall of that entire system. So does that make sense? Any questions on that? Why is it called Babylon? Remember, this will test your memory from last week a little bit. Why is the religious component tied to the city of Babylon? What's the Old Testament? Yeah, go ahead, Wayne.
Good.
Okay.
It's the
Vince.
starting point of false religion.
Absolutely. Babylon is the starting point of false religion. You go back to the Tower of Babel, and what happened there? That was the beginning of false religion. And Nimrod was the founder of that city, and his desire ultimately was to build a world religion apart from God. So, and we traced that last week through the Old Testament and looked at some of the references in the Old Testament to how Babylon is really the source of that. So in a sense, you could tie all false religions, even today, back to Babylon, back to that start, back to how that began. So all false religions of the world today, in a sense, find their heritage in Babylon, the city, but Babylon, the system as well. So that's why it's called Babylon. Because of that connection. All right? So Antichrist is going to use false religion. He's going to bring together the world under this false religion. And so that's what's coming down here in chapter 17. So we met the woman, chapter 17, verse 1. She's called the harlot. And then in verse 3, she's called the woman sitting on a scarlet beast. full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And so that's the same woman, the harlot of chapter 17, verse 1, and the woman of chapter 17, verse 3, and verse 4, and verse 6. That's the same person. But it's not an actual person. It's not an actual prostitute. It's the woman who represents this false religious system that Antichrist will use to unify the world. So we see her riding, verse 3, or sitting on a scarlet beast. Who's the beast? Who's the beast of verse 3? Who's the beast all throughout Revelation? Antichrist. And he fits the description in verse 3 that we saw back in chapter 13. And what's significant about the fact that she is sitting on the beast? Why is that?
He's supporting her.
He's supporting her. So this false world religion is supported by, sustained by, encouraged by, fueled by Antichrist. So there's a connection there between him and this system. So that kind of brings us up to speed, I think, from where we were last week. So any just questions leading up to that? So turn in your notes to page 5 from last week, and we're going to pick it up in verse 8. Notice the top of page 5 in your notes. Although John understood that the woman represented a false religious system and that the beast was the Antichrist, he was puzzled about the connection between them. In the following section, the angel provides John a lengthy description of the beast, details John needed to have in order to understand the connection between the woman and the beast. So starting in verse 8 through verse 15, we're going to get another description of Antichrist, as if you haven't had enough of that already. Chapter 13 was all about Antichrist, but you're going to get another description of him here. And the purpose of this description is to show the connection between him and this false religious system. So look at verse 8 and look what John says. He says, "The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss and to go to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth, whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will wonder when they see the beast that he was and is not and will come." So kind of some interesting terminology here. The beast was, is not, and about to come. We think probably this is a reference to his supposed death and his supposed resurrection. Remember back in chapter 13, he faked a death and then he faked his resurrection. Do you remember when we talked about that? Maybe he actually physically died and rose to life, but we said Satan doesn't have the power to do that probably. So this was probably some sort of fake death and resurrection. So that's probably what this is a reference to. The beast, the Antichrist that you saw he was alive, and then is not, he faked his death, and then is about to come up out of the abyss, probably another reference to his fake resurrection. And notice he's going to go to destruction. Verse 8, he's going to go to destruction. So this is the trajectory of Antichrist. He's on his way to judgment, he's on his way to destruction, and we're seeing that listed here. Yet, look at the middle of page 5, the world, those who dwell on the earth, described here as those whose name has not been written in the book of life. So those who are alive during the tribulation but are not believers, they're going to marvel when they see Antichrist's power and his apparent resurrection. So notice the end of verse 8. It says they'll wonder when they see the beast that he was and is not and will come. So there's going to be some sort of marveling the world is going to have when they see what happened, and they're going to be beholding some of these fake things that the Antichrist is going to do with the power of Satan. That brings us to verse 9. And then here's where we see the connection with his system. Verse 9, he says, "Here is the mind which has wisdom." In other words, if you're going to understand this, apply wisdom to this. Then he says, verse 9, "The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and they are the 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he must remain a little while. The beast which was and is not is himself also an 8th, and is one of the 7, and he goes to destruction." How's that for being really clear? A lot of details and just a lot of things. This has probably been one of the more difficult interpretations of Revelation difficult sections of Revelation to interpret. There's been all kinds of interpretations about who are the five, who's the one, who's the seventh, who's the eighth. And so it's kind of been the subject of a lot of misinterpretation. But let's kind of pick it apart and see if we can figure out what he's saying. So it says in verse 9, the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And then notice verse 10, and they are 7 kings. So it's actually not that hard. He tells us exactly what they are. So the 7 mountains are 7 kings. Some have taken those 7 mountains to refer to Rome. Apparently, Rome is built on 7 hills. Did you know that? Have you heard that before? That Rome was built on 7 hills. And so some people have looked at that and said, well, this must be Rome because it fits the 7-hill imagery. And so the capital of Antichrist's system must be Rome, and maybe the Catholic Church is part of that whole thing as well. But I don't think that's exactly what he's saying, because it says the 7 mountains are 7 kings. In other words, those 7 mountains represent 7 kings and kingdoms. All right, so that's what we think this is referring to. Top of page 6 says if the mountains represent kings, then they cannot be literal mountains. So that, again, just trying to be faithful to the text here, John says that the mountains are 7 kings. So if they're 7 kings, they're not 7 literal mountains. Now, again, we try to take things literally, but this is probably a case where the mountains represent 7 kings. And so the question is, what are these representing? So we think that these mountains represent kings or kingdoms or empires. You can look at the top of page 6, where mountains often refer to a king or a kingdom. So we think that these are 7 kingdoms, 7 Gentile kingdoms that have been in existence over the period of world history. So what are those? The 7 mountains represent 7 successive world empires and their rulers. They are 7 great world powers which stretch from the beginning of history to the end of it. So I think what you have here is a description of the Gentile kingdoms that have come and gone, and they're listed for you kind of towards the top of page 6. They are Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. Those are the first 5. Where do we see those referred to in the Old Testament? What book? Daniel. Remember the statue? Remember the visions that Daniel saw? A lot of those are the same nations. Not the first 2, but the next 3, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece, were the top portion of that statue. Remember, the head was Babylon, the chest area was Medo-Persia, the trunk was Greece. And so we think that those are the first 5, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. Now, go back to the text. What does verse 10 actually say? It says, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. So put yourself in John's shoes. He's writing in the first century. 5 of them have already fallen. So those 5 that we just listed, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, those have been dominant Gentile world kingdoms that have already come and gone by the time John is writing in the first century. Okay, then verse 10 says, and 1 is. Who's that? Rome. There is a Gentile kingdom still in power at the time John is writing Revelation. That's Rome. It's a Roman Empire. And then notice verse 10 says, and the other has not yet come. What's that referring to?
Beast.
The beast's kingdom. Exactly. So the final Gentile ruler, the final world kingdom, is going to be Antichrist's world kingdom. Now, right now, we're in the parenthesis age. We're kind of in the age between what God's doing in the nation of Israel, right? So the church age has been a parenthesis. But when the church age stops, what Gentile power is going to be in place after the rapture? It's going to be Antichrist's kingdom. So we believe that's the 7th one. So from John's perspective, 5 of them have already come and gone. Rome is in existence. And there's 1 more to come, which is Antichrist's final world empire. Yeah, Terry.
Is that the revived Roman Empire, or is that
It's the revived Roman Empire.
Or the future.
It's a revived Roman Empire. Yep. But here he separates it out as a distinct one because it'll be distinctly Antichrist kingdom.
That's probably why a lot of the interpreters put Rome as the capital too, don't
Exactly. Yeah, that's why a lot of
they? Rome is the Babylon.
yeah, that's why a lot think that Rome could be the capital of Antichrist kingdom. It could be. I think the jury's out a little bit on that. I'm not quite sure. I don't think I'd be definitive on that, but it could be Rome or it could be Babylon. Does this make sense? Make sense, sort of, what? Trying to be faithful to the text here. If the seven mountains are kings, and those kings are rulers of kingdoms, then those seven mountains must represent seven successive world empires, seven Gentile kingdoms. And so if you look back through history, those have been the dominant Gentile kingdoms that have existed. Doesn't mean that they were all worldwide empires. You can see that note kind of towards the top there. Though not world empires, each of those was the greatest kingdom of its own time, and each of them embodied the spirit of political and religious Babel. So if you think back through church history or world history, each one of those, not only was it the most dominant kingdom of its day, it also embodied what Babylon represents: false religion, idolatry, kings and rulers that don't exalt God and know God. And so Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, all of those in a sense were prefigurements of Antichrist empire because they each embodied some aspect of this false religion. So think back to the Babylonian deities and the Assyrian deities and the Medo-Persian deities. The people worship those. That's what it's going to be like, in a sense, during the tribulation when Antichrist pulls his system together. All right? Make sense? Hopefully. Then notice verse 11. It says the beast, the beast which was and is not is himself also an eighth, and is one of the seven. This is where it gets a little dicey. So just trying to figure out who's being referred to here. So apparently one of those seven kingdoms is also represented as an eighth, and he tells us exactly what it is here. The beast is himself also an eighth. So there's those seven world empires. The Antichrist himself then is the eighth. So apparently what he's referring to here is that there are seven successive world kingdoms. The seventh one is the Antichrist world kingdom, and then he himself is likely the eighth. Thank you. My nose is running. Could you tell? You had a premonition? You had a prophecy about this? Thank you, Tim. So it seems like the eighth who's referred to here in verse 11 is the beast himself. So the seventh kingdom is Antichrist's kingdom, and then the eighth is Antichrist himself. So again, lots of different kinds of interpretations to this text, but it seems like that's what's being referred to here. All right? Make sense? So what's described in verses 8 through 11 is the final form of the Gentile world power, which is an alliance with apostate religion. So let me read a very long quote to you. I know I don't like to read long quotes, but I'm going to do that because this one I think really kind of captures, if you're trying to wrap your mind around this, I found this quote. It's by a guy named, I think it's Seiss. Yeah, Joseph Seiss. And he, I think, did a good job explaining this. So let me just read this for you. You can follow along the bottom of page 6. In summarizing all this, he says, by these seven great powers, then, filling up the whole interval of this world's history, the great harlot is said to be carried. On these she rides according to the vision. It is not upon one alone, nor upon any particular number of them, but upon all of them, the whole seven-headed beast that she sits. These seven powers, each and all, support the woman as their joy and pride, and she accepts and uses them and sways their administrations and rides in glory by means of them. In other words, he's trying to describe here how these Gentile kingdoms that embody the spirit of Babylon are in a sense, really fostering and fueling this false religion. They, speaking of these world kingdoms, are her devotees, her lovers, and most humble servants, and she is their patronizing and most noble lady, with a mutuality of favors and intercommunion belonging to her designation. It is a matter of fact that as surely as Rome in John's day, and Greece, Persia, Babylon, Assyria, and Egypt before Rome existed and bore sway on earth as regal mountains, so surely and conspicuously were they each and all ridden by this great harlot. That's his way of saying Babylon was fueled by false religion, and Greece was fueled by false religion. They were each and all the lovers, supporters, and defenders of organized falsehood in religion, the patrons of idolatry, and foster friends of all manner of spiritual harlotry. Nimrod, the hunger of the sons of men, the author of despotic government, established his idolatrous inventions as the crown and glory of his empire, and intertwined the worship of idols with the standards of his power. So he's saying here, Nimrod was the first one to start this worldwide false religion. It was the same, maybe not worldwide at his point, but actually it was, because he was trying to establish a worldwide false religion. And then he goes on to say it was the same with Egypt, whose colossal remains, unfading paintings, top of page 7, and mummy scrolls confirm the scripture portraitures of her disgusting devotions, and tell how the priests of these abominations were honored by the throne, of which they were the chief advisors. It was so with Assyria. It was so with Babylon. I'm skipping ahead. It was so with Persia. It was so with Greece. It was so with Rome, as all her widespread monuments will show, and all the Christian testimonies with their own render clear and manifest as the sun. And here it is. It will be so with the last, speaking of the last kingdom, which is yet to come, as declared in the apocalyptic foreshowings and in all the prophecies in the book of God upon the subject. Now, here's this sentence. It requires but a glance at history to see that spiritual harlotry has ever been the particular pet and delight of all the beast powers of time. Long quote. I understand that. But what he's saying is each one of these Gentile kingdoms have embodied the spirit of false religion. They've not worshipped the true and living God. They've worshipped other gods. They've worshipped idols. And they've led their people in all kinds of gross kinds of religious practices, including sacrificing children and all kinds of things like that, that have embodied the spirit of this false religion that one day, in the final phase of the Antichrist system, is going to manifest itself in full form all the way around the world. Does that make sense? Do you get what I'm saying here? All right. This is the system that's going to come crashing down right before Christ comes. All right?
Are we part of that
No.
today?
We are not part of, well,
That world religion?
not in the same sense that he's referring to here. It's a good question, Tim. Are we today part of this? Now, remember, you have to understand that the church is an insertion into God's program. So that's why I wouldn't say we are necessarily there today, because we're not necessarily seen in these Gentile kingdoms. Notice none of what's listed.
Think about, though.
But it's something to think about. I think your question's a good one, in that the spirit, maybe, of false religion is still alive and well today.
We're sacrificing our babies, too.
Good point. Yeah. And you just need to look around the world today and see all kinds of evidences of false religion. So even though we're not necessarily in this specific explanation, I would definitely say that, yeah, the spirit is still prevalent. All right, then come to verses 12 to 15. So we just saw 7 kings that represented 7 kingdoms. Now we see 10 horns, verse 12. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings. So here's another set of kings. The first set of kings was 7 kings representing 7 kingdoms, Gentile kingdoms. Now he comes to see 10 horns, which are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom. But they received authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. Who's the 10 horns here, or the 10 kings here. These are the kings that make up Antichrist empire. Okay, so the 7 that you just saw were successive world powers. These 10 are the 10 kingdoms or the 10 nations that make up Antichrist's final kingdom. Remember back in the book of Daniel, the statue had how many toes? You should know that because you have 10 toes as well. So just count your toes. The statue had 10 toes representing 10 nations that would be the final part of Antichrist's world kingdom. That's what's going on here too. These are the final kingdoms that comprise the final Gentile kingdom under Antichrist. Notice verse 13. He says, these have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to the beast. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. They give their authority. They're going to come under his kingdom. They're going to give their authority to him. And verse 14 says, these will wage war against the Lamb. And the Lamb will overcome them, because he's the Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called and chosen and faithful. And he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. So this is just a description of that final ruler kingdom, rule by Antichrist. And so that's what it's going to be made up of. 10 nations that come under Antichrist's power and authority to make up Antichrist's final world power and world system. They're going to try to go to war with the Lamb, verse 14 says, but as he tells us already, the Lamb's going to overcome them, which is just a glimpse at the coming Battle of Armageddon, which we're going to see in chapter 19. So he's speaking of an event that's about to take place but hasn't taken place yet. So all of that is setting you up for the last few verses of this chapter. Okay, so I know you're going like, oh, man, this is a lot of details. Why do we have to keep going over this? We got this, or we keep hearing these things. All of that was for the purpose of setting up verses 16, 17, and 18. So if you're kind of wondering why he's going through all those details, it's to get to this point. It's the destruction of, you could add the word religious Babylon in that final heading on page 7. So not the destruction of the city itself, but the destruction of religious Babylon. So watch what happens here in verse 16. And the 10 horns which you saw, those 10 kings and nations that will allow themselves to become part of Antichrist's kingdom at the end, they will, the 10 horns which you saw, and the beast, these will hate the harlot and make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh and will burn her up with fire. What's going on there?
Their religion's disintegrating. It's been.
Yep. So they're actually now turning on the harlot. They're turning on this one world religion, and so here's what's probably going to take place at the midpoint of the tribulation. We think that, this is the bottom of page 7, we think that for the most part, in the first half of the tribulation, the beast and the harlot will work together to promote this apostate religious system. So we think that for the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, the Antichrist is going to kind of work alongside this world religion, this apostate church. They're going to be kind of working together. They're going to kind of encourage one another. The Antichrist is going to use this worldwide religion to create his world environment, his one world government, his one world empire. However, we think probably at the midpoint of the tribulation, that's a little speculative, but probably about halfway into the tribulation, bottom of page 7, he will no longer need that false religious system to help him gain control of the world. Because what's his overall objective?
Worship him.
He wants them to worship him. So you see what he's doing? He uses the world system. He uses the false religion for the first 3.5 years. He uses all of that to kind of pull it all together, but he's not going to be satisfied with that because that's not worshiping him. That's just an ecumenical, let's all hold hands and all kind of say we worship the same God and unifying the whole world. But that's not enough for him because he's so prideful and he's so arrogant that he himself is going to want the worship of himself. So that's why verse 16 says they're going to hate the harlot. So the system that Antichrist used to gain control, he's actually going to turn on it. He's going to hate that harlot. He's going to make her desolate and naked and will eat her flesh and will burn her up with fire. That's a way of saying he's going to turn on that entire system so that he himself can be put in the position of being worshipped. Verse 17, for God has put it in their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose and by giving their kingdoms to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. So, in other words, who's orchestrating all of this? God is. That's what verse 17 says. For God has put it in their hearts to execute his purpose. So, Antichrist is doing all of this. He's setting it all in place. He's pulling the world together. He's turning on the apostate religious system. And then all false religions are going to be united in following and worshiping him. And God's orchestrating all of that. Which is just tremendous, isn't it? I mean, you think this is Antichrist and this guy's off the rails and he's completely arrogant. Yeah, so God's on his throne. He's in control. He's orchestrating all of these events. He's almost manipulating all of these details like pawns on a chessboard to put everything where they need to be so that he can ultimately fulfill his purposes. What were you going to say, Wayne?
I just had a question about, who do you think the earth dwellers are worshiping before the Antichrist, before that time when the Antichrist wants them to worship him? Who is it, or is it just some kind of ambiguous kind of whatever?
That's a good question. And I would say, well, what do the false religions of the world worship today, or who do they worship today?
Well, we know it's Satan, but it's, to them, it's, I don't know. It's just.
It's all kinds of things.
It's nothing. It's a dead spirit. You know, it's nothing.
You've got Buddha. You've got Confucius. You've got Mary, in a sense.
Yeah.
You've got the earth.
But they're dead religions. There's
Exactly.
Nothing there. It's dead.
Exactly.
They're dead.
But that hasn't stopped them. That doesn't stop them today from worshiping, right? You can watch Buddhists. I mean, I was in China.
It's their self, because what Romans 1 says, they, in their own minds, they build up, they exchange the truth of God for a lie.
Exactly.
And it's made out, I guess, to their own imagination.
Exactly.
And that's, I guess, that's where it leads to the worship of the Antichrist, because then they probably got something more tangible to worship than when he comes and I mean he's going to be demanding worship by force.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways as well. It ain't going to be just, well, look at me. It will be by force as well, because you're getting their heads chopped off if they don't.
Right. Yeah, we were in China, a number of years ago, adopting our daughter Katie, and we were in Beijing. I think it was in Beijing where we toured some Buddhist temple, and it was just, I think we toured a couple of them actually. It just grieved our hearts. You've probably seen it. You've been around it. There's actually a temple right in Belmont. You probably drive. It's close to your house actually. And if you look in the windows there, not that I'm window peeking, but you can drive by and you can see Buddha in there, And we were in China just seeing people genuflecting and watching them burning incense and spinning some sort of prayer wheel, and in our heart, we were just sitting there watching this, and I think we almost just choked up just with the sadness of this empty, bankrupt, false religion. But that's what it's going to be like prior to Antichrist himself receiving the worship for himself. So I would imagine they're going to be worshiping whatever God they want it to be. So that's what's being said today. It's we all worship the same God, just in different expressions. So I would have no trouble seeing that that's going to be the way it's going to be in this one world religion as well. Just we're all kind of worshiping the same God, just different expressions of Him. What were you going to say?
Oh, this part about God accomplishing His sovereign purpose. We saw that in Daniel
Yeah.
with moving, the Babylonians.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. I mean, he used the Babylonians to judge the Israelites. Then he used the Medo-Persians to judge the Babylonians. Then he used the Greeks to judge the Medo-Persians. Then he used the Romans to judge the Greeks. And so, yeah, this is just another reminder that God, this is all on His divine timetable. This is going exactly as He planned it. He's got His fingers on all of this. Nothing happens without Him already orchestrating it and accomplishing it. So, just on a practical level, it's such a good reminder to us. We're not in this age yet. We're not in the tribulation, but when you see world events and airliners being blown out of the sky in Iran because of missiles being shot at it, and a president of our country being impeached, and just all the things that are going on in the world scale, you just have to sit back and say, our God is still on His throne. And there is no question whatsoever that He's got this all part of His plan. Yeah, Bill, what were you going to say?
What's perplexing is that it's so drawn out and God could do it right away. And I can't wrap my arms around why He just doesn't do it, I don't get it,
Yeah, I think in our flesh we're like, come on, just let's get this going, right? Let's just accomplish this. Let's bring it to pass. Number one, He's patient, exceedingly patient.
Yeah.
Number two, Romans 11 says the full number of Gentiles have not come in yet.
Yes.
Israel's on hold until the full number of Gentiles come in.
Yeah.
So, in fact, go there.
He's not willing that any should perish.
Exactly. So, test your memory of our preaching through Romans 9 through 11. But isn't this the point of Romans 11, that there's still a future for Israel? Israel's on hold right now. Verse 25, Romans 11:25. I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, lest you be wise in your own estimation that a partial hardening has happened in Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And then all Israel will be saved, just as it is written. And he goes on to talk about it. So, the full number of Gentiles have not been saved yet. The elect of God amongst the Gentiles have not yet been redeemed. So, get on with your evangelism and let's get this moving, right? Get out there sharing the gospel so we can speed this along and go find the elect.
We better get missionaries in Israel on, right?
Yeah, we better get missionaries in Israel and all around the world.
It's amazing that through all this, and through all history, man has a God consciousness, a need for God of some sort. And usually they make up their own. But we're still, somehow down deep, they don't feel adequate. They need a God. And it's having this real religion,
Yeah. So-
looking for satisfaction from that.
Yeah, so Tim's saying that this is evidence that people have a need and a desire to worship something. Was it Ecclesiastes says God has put eternity in their hearts? Augustine said it this way: God has created a God-shaped hole in the heart of every human. In other words, a desire that only He can fulfill. But what does unregenerate, depraved man do? They try, as Romans 1 says, as Wayne said, they try to fill it with something else. They worship the creature rather than the Creator.
Is that one of the ways that we are created in His image?
Absolutely.
That we have this God consciousness?
Absolutely. Created to be in a relationship with Him. But that's what sin does. Sin destroys that. Yeah, Terry?
It was kind of over this chapter, realizing how the people and the masses flock to the Antichrist and because of the wonders and this and that. Isn't it amazing that he does that fake death, if it, everybody is fake, and death and resurrection on how the people flock to him, and yet when Christ, in reality, did exactly the same thing, and people scoffed and tried to set up fake situations, how that happened.
Sure.
And so I don't, it's just amazing why people couldn't believe that, but they fall so easily for this.
Yeah. Yeah, and part of the reason for that is, according to 2 Thessalonians, there's going to be a deluding influence sent amongst them. So if you read 2 Thessalonians, I think it's chapter 2, he says that, let's see if I can find it here. Verse 11. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 11. For this reason God will send upon them a deluding influence, so that they might believe what is false, in order that they may all be judged who did not believe the truth. So one of the reasons that there's going to be this flocking to worship Antichrist is because of demonic encouragement or demonic influence to make that happen. He's going to deceive people into worshiping him.
It's kind of like God just kind of turns over whatever they want. That he
Yep.
says, you're free to have at it.
Exactly.
Because they've rejected the truth.
Yep, exactly. All right, so that's the destruction of Babylon's false religion. So, and we, like I said, we think that probably the midpoint of that tribulation is when that's going to take place, and that's going to come crashing down. And chapter 18.
Before the tribulation or the two prophets.
The two witnesses.
Yeah, I'm sorry, witnesses.
Yeah, chapter 11 talks about it.
So
We-
where in the 7 years?
They could be operating the whole tribulation. It's hard to know for sure exactly, but I wouldn't be surprised if their ministry spans most of the tribulation age. Yeah. All right, let's go to chapter 18. And we are now coming to the announcement and the prediction of the downfall of commercial Babylon. All right, so chapter 17 was the downfall of religious Babylon and how that whole system is going to unravel eventually. Now we come to chapter 18, which deals with the downfall of commercial and economic Babylon. So look, kind of maybe a fourth bullet down. This is evident from the numerous references in the chapter to Babylon's commerce and industry. So let me just take you through chapter 18, just some of these verses. I want you to notice how many times in chapter 18 it refers to merchants and commerce. Look at chapter 18, verse 3. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the passion of her immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth. So this is reference to those who are engaging in the commerce of Antichrist system. Look at verse 11 to 13. Same kind of thing. The merchants of the earth weep and mourn over her, and cargoes, actual goods, are going to be destroyed. And so you can see it referred to there. Look at verse 15, the merchants of these things. Verse 17 refers to the shipmasters and those who have been plying their trades through the commerce system on the seas. Then verse 19 talks about all the ships at sea that had become rich by her wealth. And then verse 22 talks about harps and musicians and trumpeters and craftsmen. None of that's going to be heard anymore. So what we're talking about here in chapter 18 is the whole commercial, economic, financial system of Antichrist. And so if you think about what major nations are like. They have a commerce system. They have a system of buying and trading and imports and exports, and they have a financial base that goes along with that. And so there's this whole commercial empire that makes up nations and kingdoms, right? Our country has it. China has it. India has it. I mean, the major powers of the world, all countries have it to some degree. But there is this commercial system upon which the nation or the kingdom operates. Well, Antichrist is going to have one of those. His system, his world empire, is going to have something like that. It's going to buy and trade and sell, and it's going to be lucrative, and it's going to be the greatest commercial empire the world has ever known. So if you can imagine just the economy of the U.S. or the economy of China and ramp that up to some higher level under Antichrist, that's what it's going to be like. Massive commercial system that is going to fuel his empire. It's going to be, money's going to be pouring in, and there's going to be all kinds of buying and selling and all kinds of wealth and riches that make up his system, just like any other nation. And so that system is eventually going to come crashing down as part of God's judgment upon Babylon. That's what this chapter is about. It's about the destruction of his commercial system. Chapter 7, one significant difference, or 17, one significant difference, though, between these two chapters. Notice the 6th bullet down, maybe. One significant difference between Revelation 17 and 18 is this. In chapter 17, it was the beast who destroyed Babylon's religious system so that he could be the object of worship. Remember, we just talked about that, end of chapter 17. He turns on that false apostate religious system and becomes the object of that worship. So he destroys that religious system so he could be the focus of it. Now in chapter 18, it's God who destroys Babylon's commercial enterprises. So there's a difference between these two chapters in that sense. They both describe a downfall of his empire, but in chapter 17, Antichrist destroys his own, or the world religious system to become that world religion. And then in chapter 18, it's God who's going to destroy Babylon's commercial enterprises. So just an interesting relationship between these two chapters, right? So as you come to chapter 18, that's what this is all about. Any thoughts on this?
What drives the whole world system is greed and self-fulfillment. And people are willing to pay a lot of money for that. I mean, look at how sin is merchandised today.
Yep.
You know, and everybody, oh, wow, see somebody do it, you know, just
Yep. Yep. So what fuels these systems? It's money, it's greed, it's power. Just think about some of the world leading nations today and what fuels that. It's money, it's prestige. All of that is going to be part of his system and his commercial enterprise. So having said that, let's just kind of walk through this chapter and we'll kind of pick it apart for a little bit. So chapter 18, verses 1 to 3, he announces that this portion of the empire is going to come crashing down. So verse 1, after these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illumined with his glory. Look at just a couple bullets below that. An angel shows up announcing this doom, and he comes to earth illumined in his glory. Now remember, the whole world was plunged into darkness in the 5th bowl judgment. So just think about it. Just in your mind, picture this. The world is dark.
Is there electricity? I mean, if all this trade and merchandise.
Probably.
Yeah.
So there might be lights still, but the world itself, the sun has gone out. And coming across the sky, or in some way, this angel from heaven shows up, illumined with his glory. You can almost see this contrast between the blackness of earth and the incredible illuminating glory of this angel sent from heaven. And notice what he says in verse 2, with a mighty voice. He says, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird." So here's this angel showing up, announcing Babylon is fallen. Again, it's not happened entirely yet, but it's an announcement of it. It's about to happen. And notice there's two reasons that this angel gives for the downfall of the system. Bottom of page 1, the two reasons for her downfall are stated on the top of page 2. Number 1, it's demonic activity. And number 2, wretched sensuality. These are the reasons why the system is coming down. So notice verse 2, she has become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. Those phrases capture the demonic influence of his system. So there's going to be millions, billions of demons that are a part of this system. So that's why he calls it a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean bird. You remember back in Matthew 13, in that parable of the sower and the seed, what came and stole the seed off the pathway? It was a bird. And remember, Jesus goes on to explain that that's what the devil does. He steals the word of God from the hearts of people. There, he connects demonic power with birds. And so it may be that's what's being referred to here, just another reference to the demonic system. So the one reason they need to come down is because of its demonic activity. Number 2, they need to be destroyed because of their wretched sensuality. And that's what you see in verse 3. I know we've already read it, but again, notice verse 3. For the nations have drunk of the wine of the passion of her immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her. Again, not referring here to actual physical adultery. This is not an actual harlot, a prostitute that they're engaged in immorality with, although I wouldn't be surprised if that's going to be part of his system. But this is a reference to how the fact that the kings, and notice the end of verse 3, the merchants of the earth have in a sense prostituted themselves with this entire system, so that by the end of verse 3 says they become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. It's spiritual adultery. They've committed spiritual harlotry. They in a sense sold themselves to Antichrist commercial system. That's, I think, what's being referred to here. So they want money, they want materialism, they want wealth, they want riches. And so they're going to cash in on Antichrist system. That's why this terminology of committing acts of immorality with her. They have joined themselves to Antichrist system so that, end of verse 3 says, they could become rich. That they're after the same thing the world's always after, money and materialism. And so that's why this system has been so deadly and why it's going to be judged. By the way, middle of page 2, no wonder they will mourn greatly when their entire economic and commercial system comes crashing down. Let me give you a little preview. Go to verse 9. It says, the kings of the earth who committed acts of immorality and lived sensuously with her will weep and lament over her when they see the smoke of her burning. So all of these nations, all of these kings, all of these leaders, all of these people who have prostituted themselves to join Antichrist in his system so that they can become rich and be part of his fame and his wealth, when they see it all come crashing down, they start to weep. Not because they're sad over their sin and not because of the depravity of Babylon, but why?
Because they're going to be rich no more.
They're not going to be rich anymore. Their capacity to make money and be famous and buy wealth or use wealth and get materialism, it's all gone. So that's what's going on in this chapter. Make sense?
You'll be jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, probably.
It might be. It might be.
Not only their wealth is gone, but all their aspiring energies and efforts that they put into it, they got to see that going up in smoke too.
Yeah.
Yeah, everything is for naught.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. This is what you live for. If this is what you live for and it's all gone, you have nothing left to live for, right? Your love of money, your love of materialism, if this is what drives you and compels you and motivates you, and that system is now gone and bankrupt, your whole purpose of existence is essentially gone. And so we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Notice verses 4 and 5, though there is this call to separate from Babylon. There's a call to separate from this system to those who are believers still at that time, which I just find amazing. You've still got believers alive in the tribulation at this time. But that's exactly what he's referring to. Look at verse 4. He says, I heard another voice from heaven, not the same one as the angel that we just saw, but another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sins and receive of her plagues. For her sins have piled up as high as the heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. So there's this summons to the tribulation saints that are still alive, come out of the city. And I think perhaps he's actually referring to the actual city here, Babylon itself. If you're still alive and you're a believer in Babylon at the time all this is happening, you better get out of there. It's almost like Abraham and Lot. You better get out of there, because this is going to be fire and brimstone in just a little bit. You better run for your life. And I think that's actually what he's referring to. It's a summons to abandon the city, maybe a summons to abandon the system as well. It could be an invitation to people to still get saved at the end of the tribulation, and this opportunity to flee it before it's too late. Notice the bottom of page 2. This is similar to God's invitation for his people to leave Babylon in the Old Testament. So we have this invitation to leave Babylon just before its destruction here at the tribulation, but there's a parallel in the Old Testament that this was God's invitation to his people in the time of their exile in Babylon too. So look at Isaiah 48. Go forth from Babylon, flee from the Chaldeans. As Jeremiah 50, verse 8, wander away from the midst of Babylon and go forth from the land of the Chaldeans. Jeremiah 51 says, flee from the midst of Babylon, each of you, and save his life. Do not be destroyed in her punishment. Interesting. Same thing that was said in the Old Testament with Babylon is going to be said someday about the Babylon that's in existence at the time of the Antichrist. Okay, so come out of her. Flee from this. Why? Verse 5 says, because her sins have piled up as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. And the imagery here is almost like the Tower of Babel again. It's almost this, in fact, the language is piled up. It's actually been glued together like brick upon brick. So her sins, Babylon's sins, have piled up as high as heaven. You've got this picture of the Tower of Babel again, and all of their wickedness. It's almost like the Tower of Babel 2.0. And it's been all poured together and welded together, and the system of Babylon just continues to go higher and higher and higher, and it's this new Tower of Babel in a sense, and it says in verse 5, God's going to remember that, and God's going to destroy them for it. There will be no forgiveness, only the judgment. And so there's the summons to the believers at that time, come out. Verse 4 says, come out of her, my people, so that you will not participate in her sin. Number one, that's the first reason they got to come out, so they don't get sucked into this. And then number two, so they don't receive her plagues, so they don't get caught up in this destruction. So here's this summons for them to flee from the city and flee from that system. Which, again, this is not us today. We're not in this time frame. This is still tribulation. But right in the middle of page 3, I just put some verses about the importance of believers today separating from the seductive world that we live in. Right? So there's a parallel here for us that we need to be those who are not conformed to this world. We need to be those who are not loving this world. We need to keep ourselves unstained by the world. We need to not make ourselves friends of this world or love this world. 1 John 2 says, do not love the world or the things in it. So, again, not the same issue, but there's a principle there that this world will not satisfy you. And this world will suck you in, and it will attempt to give you some level of satisfaction, and in the end it will not provide you the satisfaction you're looking for. So, just another good reminder to us today that riches don't satisfy today. Materialism does not satisfy today. A new house, a bigger car, more money in your portfolio, none of that satisfies. Loving the world and its system and its movies and its music and all that, it just doesn't satisfy. So there's this summons to come out of it. So, any thoughts on that? All right. Well, why does Babylon need to be destroyed? Why does Antichrist's system and a city need to come down? Well, in the next section gives us the justification for that. And he notice 3 reasons here why Babylon needs to be destroyed. Her deeds, verse 6, her sensuality, verse 7, and her arrogance. So notice verse 6. He says, pay her back, Babylon, pay her back, even as she has paid, and give back to her double according to her deeds. In the cup which she has mixed, mix twice as much for her. We'll stop right there. Notice he says, pay her back for her deeds. So there's this summons. Here's the reason, one of the reasons why Babylon needs to be destroyed, because of her wicked deeds. And notice this angel says, and make sure that you double it. Make sure that you make the punishment of Babylon twice as much as she has done to others. In other words, this is some serious punishment that's coming upon Antichrist system. You have the law of retaliation. Remember lex talionis in the Old Testament, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth? That's kind of the idea here, except it's doubled. They've done these things to the world. They've seduced the world. They've turned the world against the Lord. They've done all of these wicked things. And so Babylon needs to be paid back for what they've done and their wicked system, in fact, make it twice as much. So that's the first reason. Babylon needs to be destroyed because of her wicked deeds. Then top of page 4 talks about the second reason. You can see it in verse 7, her sensuality. Notice verse 7, Revelation 18:7. To the degree that she glorified herself and lived sensuously, to the same degree give her torment and mourning. So there's a second reason why she needs to receive judgment, because she has been sensual. She has engaged her sensual desires. Again, probably not talking about literal physical sensuality and immorality, although that's probably going to be part of it. More here, the lust of materialism, the lust of things, the desire for money, trapping people in this system where they're trying to clamor for more stuff and more income and more money just to be part of this wicked system, and it seduced people. And so that's the sensuality that's being referred to here. And third reason, you can see at the end of verse 7, for she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, and I am not a widow, and will never see mourning. So third reason for her destruction is her arrogance. She boasts, I'm a queen. She says, I'm in charge. I'm the one that people worship. I'm the one in authority. It's pride, it's arrogance, and I'm not a widow. What would that be? Why would that be communicating a reason for Babylon's destruction? What's the idea behind saying, I'm not a widow?
She could take care of herself.
She can take care of herself. Is that what you said?
No, see, goes over there.
Yeah. She can take care of herself. I don't need anybody to help me. We're self-sufficient. We're completely self-reliant. That's the idea. That's the spirit of Antichrist system. We don't need anybody. We are set. We've got our whole system working. It's running. There's commerce going on. We're thriving economically. That's the idea here. We don't need anybody to help us. That attitude of arrogance and pride and a declaration of self-sufficiency. Notice, right in the middle of page 4, this is exactly what historical Babylon said. It's interesting, the parallels between Old Testament Babylon and Antichrist system. There's a number of parallels here, but notice Isaiah 47. This is actually the verse that John is quoting here. You can notice, if you notice in verse 7 of chapter 18, it may actually be a quote. It may be a literal quote from this Isaiah passage. And notice what Isaiah says. You said, speaking of Babylon, I will be a queen forever. These things you do not consider, nor remember the outcome of them. Now then hear this, you sensual one, same idea here, sensuality, who dwells securely, who says in your heart, I am, and there's no one beside me, I will not sit as a widow. Same terminology. Nor no loss of children. We're fine, we're good, we're self-sufficient, we're self-reliant. This is historical Babylon. Then verse 9, look how it begins, first word, but. These two things will come on you suddenly in one day, loss of children and widowhood. They will come on you in full measure in spite of your many sorceries, in spite of the great power of your spells. So what's going to happen to historical Babylon? They're going to be destroyed. What's going to happen to Antichrist's Babylon system? It's also going to be destroyed. So they're going to be completely judged and destroyed when Christ returns. And notice what's going to happen. Notice verse 8 back in Revelation chapter 18. Notice verse 8 says, "For this reason, because of her deeds, because of her sensuality, because of her pride and arrogance, for this reason," verse 8 says, "in one day her plagues will come." I don't think that necessarily means 24 hours. I'm not sure it necessarily just means one literal day, but he's referring to the fact it's going to come quick. It's going to come really fast. Notice what he says, "Pestilence and mourning and famine shall be burned with fire, for the Lord who judges her is strong." So he's just kind of piling this terminology on here to explain the kind of judgment that Babylon's going to come under. It's going to happen very quickly. It's going to happen probably before they even know it's happening. Instantly, plagues, pestilence, mourning, famine. Again, what happened to historical Babylon? When did they fall? They fell overnight. Remember? Remember the city was on the Euphrates River? And what did the Persians do? Remember that story from Daniel? Remember the history says they came up the river. They diverted the river and lowered its levels, and they were able to march into the city of Babylon in the middle of the night when Belshazzar is having a massive party, and they walk into the party and they slay everybody, and Babylon comes crashing down. That's how the Medo-Persians took over Babylon. Same idea. It's going to happen in Antichrist Babylon. It's going to come quick, and before they know it, they're going to be judged, and the whole thing's going to come crashing down. So very interesting. Just again, the connections between historical Babylon and the Babylon of Antichrist.
Makes you think about the parable of the farmer that tore down his barns and built new big ones, and then he was at ease,
Yep.
and that night he died.
I put it right there. It's Luke 12. Great segue. Right, exactly, Tim. That's Jesus told them the parable. The land of the rich man was very productive, and he was reasoning to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and foods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have laid up goods for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your soul will be required of you."
I didn't read that, really.
You're just tracking with me, Tim. It's good. That's exactly what's going to happen. So
Maybe it will happen in one day.
it might. It might happen. It might happen in less than 24 hours. It might happen, boom, instantaneously. But yeah. So what are the people of Antichrist system going to think about this? How are they going to respond to this? Now, just imagine all the people that have bought into the system, all the kings, all the rulers, all the people, all the elite that have engaged themselves into the system. They're making money. There's materialism. There's wealth. Antichrist system is running on all cylinders. There's all kinds of fame and riches that are happening because of this. What's going to happen when it all comes crashing down? Starting in verse 9, he tells us, this is just fascinating to me. He tells us 3 different groups of people that are affected by this, and they're all affected in the same way: kings, merchants, and sea merchants. So look at verse 9. I'm on page 5. What is notable about this section is that those who are part of her system do not grieve or mourn over their sin, but rather over the destruction of Babylon. They're grieved over the fact that their capital system is gone. Their means of financial gain is gone. And so the kings are the first ones described here in verse 9. He says, "And the kings of the earth who committed acts of immorality and lived sensuously with her will weep and lament over her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance because of the fear of her torment, saying, 'Woe, woe, the great city Babylon, the strong city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come.'" Notice the very thing that was spoken in verse 8. One day, that's exactly what's going to happen. So it says in one day, verse 8, this is going to happen. The kings of the earth say, It happened in one day, again, or 1 hour, actually, in this case. So it's even shorter than the one day. So notice verse 9 says they're going to weep and they're going to lament. They're going to sob openly and they're going to beat their breast. That's the idea. You can just imagine the grief and the sorrow and the mourning over the fact that their wealth and their power and their money has been stripped from them. Their whole economic system is coming crashing down. And the kings of the earth say, no.
I kind of imagine that's what it'll be like if the internet is gone tomorrow. Can you imagine?
Sounds like the fall of Wall Street.
If
Yeah.
the internet was gone tomorrow,
Yeah.
who could still function?
Yeah. Yeah. That's unfortunate how attached we are to it, right? Yeah, you brought up Wall Street. I mean, what happened in this country in the 1930s? I think it was 1930. The Great Depression hit, Wall Street crashed, and it was devastating. If you talk to your grandparents or great-grandparents or heard about this, I mean, this was devastating. The Dust Bowls and everything that came as a result of that. Now magnify that around the world, and you can see how just devastating this is going to be. So the kings mourn. Notice the middle of page 5, the merchants mourn. Notice verse 11, and they just read and just kind of listen to this list of things here. Verse 11 says, and the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her. Same terminology. They'll weep and lament. They'll weep and mourn because no one buys their cargoes anymore. And then notice this whole list. I listed for you on the bottom of page 5. But just notice the list. Cargoes of gold and silver and precious stones and pearls. So there's the first category of costly goods and ornaments and precious things. Then verse 12 continues, and fine linen and purple and silk and scarlet. There you've got fancy clothes, all kinds of wonderful clothes that make you look fancy. And then verse 12 goes on, and every kind of citron wood. It's kind of cypress, very fancy wood that furniture was made out of that day. And every article of ivory, and every article made from very costly wood. So here you've got rich furnishings. So notice the catalog of things that are coming crashing down. All the precious metals now are gone. The expensive clothes are gone. All the nice things that you put in your really fancy home, the nice furniture, that's all gone. Notice the end of verse 12, and bronze and iron and marble, all still part of those furnishings. Then verse 13 says, and cinnamon and spice and incense and perfume and frankincense, so these precious perfumes, these wonderful things that made everything smell well and were very expensive in that day, that's all going to be gone. Then the middle of verse 13 says, and wine and olive oil and fine flour and wheat. So now you've got all the expensive foods, they're gone. So, no more sushi and all those wonderful things that you love and pay all kinds of money for. That's going to be completely destroyed. Then keep reading, verse 13, and cattle and sheep and cargoes of horses. Back up. So cattle and sheep, talking about again, more expensive foods. And then this cargoes of horses and chariots, so these extravagant items that you would have if you're rich, these nice carts or whatever that would haul you around, and chariots and all those expensive things, they're gone. And then notice the end of verse 13, and slaves and human lives. Antichrist is going to bring back slavery. He's going to bring back the slave trade, apparently. And so part of his...
I'm not sure that it's gone now in China.
True.
I mean, there are factories and everything.
Absolutely.
You have human trafficking around the world too.
Yeah, you've got human trafficking going on.
But maybe during this time it will be more widely acceptable and
Yep.
openly done.
Yep. By the way, I heard Grand Rapids is a hot spot for sex trafficking. It's one of the, major areas in Michigan for sex trafficking to occur. So it's happening, and it's happening now. But it appears that Antichrist is actually going to use human slavery as part of his system. Well, that's all going to be gone. Terry, you have a question?
It's not debating, but
could just refer to the general workforce too, and it's so demeaned under all of the
It could be.
greed of the owners and all that.
It could be. Yeah, you're right.
Oh,
It could be. It just seems interesting, though, that he uses the term slaves. I don't know. You're right. It could be something generic as that. Then verse 14 says, "The fruit you long for has gone from you, and all the things that were luxurious and splendid have passed away from you, and men will no longer find them." So their whole economic system is bankrupt. Their whole means of their commercial practices are gone. They're done. It's come crashing down. In verse 15, "The merchants of these things who became rich from her will stand at a distance because of the fear of her torment." You can almost picture this. These people that are involved in this economic system are going to be standing in the outskirts of Babylon watching it burn, far enough away so they don't get caught up in it. And they're weeping and they're mourning, the end of verse 15 says, saying, "Woe, woe, the great city." Notice the same thing that the king said in verses 9 and 10. "Woe, woe, the great city. Who is clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones." I mean, Antichrist system and kingdom is going to be massively rich. It's going to be the richest kingdom in the world. All kinds of money, all kinds of wealth, all kinds of riches, and it's going to all be laid waste, verse 17 says. In 1 hour, it will all be laid waste. So you've got the kings of the earth completely undone by this. You've got the merchants, those who are actually involved in the trading and the selling and the buying and all that. Then notice on page 6, the sea merchants are the next ones. So imagine the ship captains and this whole commercial system that is being fueled by ships taking goods and selling goods. This whole commercial system on the sea of transporting goods, that whole system is undone, and they're going to recognize this. Verse 17b says, "And every shipmaster and every passenger and sailor, as many as make their living by the sea, stood at a distance, and were crying out as they saw the smoke of the burning, saying, 'What city is like this great city?' And they threw dust on their heads." This is, as you know, a way of manifesting not repentance, but grief. They're mourning. They're grieving, and were crying out, weeping and mourning, saying, "Woe, woe, the great city." Notice the same thing they said. The king said, and the same thing the merchant said. "Woe, woe, the great city, in which all who had ships at sea became rich by her wealth. And in 1 hour it's all been laid waste."
Imagine there'll be a lot of anger too, along with the weeping. Because I heard this.
Yeah,
I heard this. Somebody took it away from me.
yeah. Yeah, this is going to erupt in chaos. And you can just see the whole system starting to unravel. Now, Christ hasn't even come back yet. He's still not even here. And this is what's happening to this system right before his return. Let's finish and just kind of end out these notes tonight. What's going to happen then? What's heaven going to do with this? Notice the rejoicing over Babylon's fall, bottom of page 6. Verse 20 says, "Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her." So heaven and everyone in it is summoned to rejoice, right? So heaven and those inhabitants of heaven, all the saints there, they're said, "Praise the Lord, worship him, because he's finally pronounced judgment for you against her." Who might he be referring to in the "for you"? What group of people would have? The martyrs. So remember the question the martyrs asked back in Revelation 6. How long before you avenge our blood? Could it be that heaven here is being told to rejoice, and particularly the martyrs are being told, you wanted to know how long? Here's how long. It's coming down. And then notice verse 21. "Then a strong angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, 'So will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and will not be found any longer. So this angel picks up a millstone. You know, the millstone is that big stone that's used to turn and put wheat and grind wheat. It's this massive stone. It's thrown into the sea, and because of that, it's a representation of the city itself being destroyed. By the way, again, a similar depiction of that at the bottom of page 6 in Jeremiah chapter 51. Same kind of imagery that was used there. Verse 63 says, as soon as you finish reading the scroll, you will tie a stone to it and throw it in the middle of the Euphrates and say, just so so shall Babylon sink down and not rise up again because of the calamity that I'm going to bring upon her, and they will become exhausted. So here's Old Testament Babylon being pictured, its destruction with a millstone being thrown into the Euphrates. Now fast forward to Antichrist's government and his system, and it too is going to be pictured by this millstone being thrown into the sea. And then turn the page, notice just top of page 7, this whole list of things that are going to happen as a result of this. Starting in verse 21, it's going to be thrown down with violence. It will not be found any longer. Verse 22, the sound of harpists will be gone from the city. The sound of musicians will be gone from the city. The sound of flute players will be gone from the city. The sound of trumpeters will not be heard in you any longer. Just imagine this. Like the sounds of the city are gone. Verse 22, no craftsman of any craft will be found in you any longer. There's not going to be any production, no factories building things, no craftsmen plying their trade. It's all done. And to verse 22, the sound of a mill will not be heard, no food being made anymore. Verse 23, and the light of a lamp will not shine in you any longer. The lights are going out. And then notice this little thing in verse 23, and the voice of the bridegroom and bride will not be heard in you any longer. What's one of the most joyous things? It's the joy of a bride and a bridegroom being married. That there's no more weddings. It's gone. For your merchants were the great men of the earth, because all the nations were deceived by your sorcery. And in her was found the blood of prophets and saints and all who have been slain on the earth. So top of page 7 just lists all those things. It's going to be gone. It's just the city's going to be utterly destroyed. There's going to be a breakdown of society at every level. By the way, in fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy. Do you remember Daniel's prophecy when it talked about those 4 kingdoms? Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and the 5th kingdom? What does the 5th kingdom do to that statue? Crushes it. Remember, look at Daniel chapter 2. It says the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold were all crushed at the same time because there was this, remember the stone that was cut without hands that's thrown against the statue that Daniel sees in chapter 2? So notice down to Daniel chapter 2, verse 45. Inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. This is when it's fulfilled. The final kingdom of Christ is about to come, and it's going to crush the entire Gentile kingdom system represented by the Antichrist system itself. So Daniel 2 is fulfilled at the end of the tribulation and the coming of Christ's kingdom. So I think that's about it. Thoughts on this?
I just have a question. The martyrs that they speak about, are martyrs going to have a better or a special place in heaven or those who aren't martyred?
Are martyrs going to have a special place in heaven? Possibly. It's possible because they were faithful in the midst of persecution, and they were faithful to the end, even in death. And 1 Corinthians 3 says that God's going to reward those who are faithful, right? And there's really no greater level of faithfulness than not rejecting Christ in the midst of persecution. So it wouldn't surprise me if they have greater levels of privilege. Pretty amazing chapter, isn't it? So I know it's a lot of details and it's a lot of stuff to wade through, but man, it's just tremendous that we know how it ends. So here's the deal. Next week, come back. Chapter 19 is when we get to actually see the return of Christ. But before we talk about the return of Christ, something happens in heaven. with the saints who are already in heaven before he returns, something called the marriage supper of the Lamb. So we need to talk about that first, beginning of chapter 19, and then we'll talk about his actual return. So that's where we're going next week. Fair enough?
That's where we're going.
That's where we're going. Lord willing, and the rapture doesn't happen. All right, see you next week.